Hello again. My name is Charles R. Sabo, and I'm doing another teaching video on a book that I just released back in, I think it was April. It might have been May. I take it back, it was May. May of this year. I spent the first part of the year writing it. It's 11 chapters, obviously. Genesis 1 through 11, the most debated um, place in the Bible. Genesis 1 through 11 is twisted and turned and into false doctrines that corrupt the church, that take God's glory away from him, that atheists twist into falsities. Satan uses Genesis 1 through 11 against God's word. It's all exaggerated and it's terrible. So I'm giving you the exact interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 in this book. The book here, it's on the market. It's a Bible commentary, great for universities, great for seminary. Great seminary needs to learn the truth of Genesis 1 through 11. Here we go, chapter 8. We're into the flood. Chapter 7 revealed the floodwaters. I've got the first 7 chapters on video here on YouTube. I suggest you watch the series in full, because you got to understand what's going on here in the flood. You got to understand it. And so you got to start, if you're going to understand the flood, you got to start in chapter 4. Understand chapter 4, chapter 5, then chapter 6 to be able to find out what's going on in the earth, and then chapter 7 and 8. All right, the preparation for the flood, and the flood waters came. Now we're going to be, the ship's on the flood waters, and then the waters recede. And so let's learn about the receding of the waters, because it's very informative of how the world became as it is right now. Okay, so let's go into introduction of chapter 8. This is from the PDF file from the book, and I'll start reading. Genesis chapter 8 begins at an appropriate starting point, which is the stopping of the increase, then the receding of the waters upon the land. There can be 3 important questions that a person may have when pondering on the condition of the earth at this point. Where did all the water go once God stopped the rains and fountains of the deep? If the high hills of the earth were no more than 22 feet high all over the globe, how do we have the high mountains of today? And yes, back in chapter 7, I show you the verse that indicates that there were no mountains, they were hills, and they were no higher than 22 and a half feet. Okay? And then number 3, if the Pangea of dry land was on the earth to this point, Genesis 1, 9, and 10 confirms Pangea. Earth, the land of the earth was all in one place, all connected in one place. That's confirmed in Genesis 1, 9, and 10. If the Pangea was in place until this point, how do we have 7 continents consisting of many islands all over the earth? Obviously, the floodwaters came, changed everything, but how did this happen that the 7 continents were displaced and spread out through the globe? Okay, so as I investigate this chapter, I will draw conclusions based on the text, all right, which Moses had written. A person needs to use common sense based on facts noted within chapter 8 in order to make reasonable conclusions. Knowing that the creator of the universe manifested changes to the earth at this point, what seems impossible is absolutely possible with him. Nothing's impossible with God. So, if you got the open mind that we're dealing with God here, he created everything, he has control over everything on the earth, and so if he's pouring wrath on the earth and causing the flood, chapter 8 explains what the flood, how God changed the earth, the structure, the whole topography of the earth changed in chapter 8. So let's go into that. So verse 1, and God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. The translators use the verb remembered for the Hebrew verb zakar, which is more appropriately defined as brought to mind. There's a difference from remembering. Remembering means you forgot. God doesn't forget. He's perfect. But certain things that occur will bring to mind, okay, this is next. He didn't forget. It's just that he has a plan, and so he gets to a point, and so he goes, okay, we're at this point, I can then change things. So the omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent God of heaven does not forget. While his plan was being fulfilled, the Lord brought to his mind Noah and all the living in the ark. When the time had come, which was pre-planned, God began to make his changes to the earth. It was then time to make the earth livable again for those who were in the ark. Currently, with water all over the earth, there's no land. He's got to make it livable. Okay, so here we go. What did he do? Now, though there may have already been heavy winds through the complete 40 days and nights of the thunderstorms upon the earth, the winds most likely calmed for the remaining 110 days, 150 minus 40, rain 40 days and 40 nights. For 150 days, the waters were increasing. You can get that back in the previous, I think, chapter 7, verse 24. Once the 150 days had expired, God brought to his mind the living creatures in the ark and began his task in preparing the earth for them. He began by bringing a drying wind to pass over the earth. When water dries, it actually evaporates into the Earth's atmosphere, which accumulates into clouds. So this water cycle has begun. Had never happened on the Earth before, the water cycles. Now, you remember, the misting system on the Earth was watering the vegetation. There was no rain for 1,656 years. There are no clouds for 1,656 years. Evaporation of the water didn't happen. It stayed on the ground to use. I imagine there might have been a brief water evaporation because they took baths, and maybe they had to dry themselves because it didn't evaporate. I don't know. Maybe they had, I mean, obviously they had sweat, so maybe there was evaporation, but where did the water go? Maybe the water was allowed to go past the atmosphere into the water that was being held up above the earth. So speculation to this point, nothing dogmatic. From this first preparation, we can conclude the water was entering into the new recycling system. The water cycle is a process that recirculates Earth's water through the stages of evaporation, condensation, and collection. The water from lakes, oceans, rivers, and other water bodies evaporates. Vapor from the water bodies rises and condenses into clouds, later causing precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, whatever. As it rains, hails, sleets, or snows, the water is collected back on Earth to start the cycle again. Because the waters were evaporating from the drying wind, the waters began to recede. Assuaged. So the word assuaged means recede. So the waters were finally receding. After prevailing and increasing for 150 days, finally God stopped the increase. Actually, he stopped the increase after 40 days, right? So he stopped the increase after 40 days. For 110 days, the water prevailed. It wasn't receding, right? And so at the point, day 151, the drying wind came, the waters began to recede. Now, did all this water evaporate from off the earth and all of a sudden there were mountains 5 miles high, 3 miles high, however high these mountains became? No, there wasn't water 5 miles high around the earth, and then all of a sudden you have to try to displace this water, you know, and the ocean's being miles deep. All of a sudden you have to evaporate all this water. Think about it. It's absolutely absurd. And God's not absurd, and everything's possible with God, but God had a system already ready to go, a plan. So let's figure out what he did. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Right? So you can see that for that 150 days, it was still, it wasn't raining, but the waters from underneath the earth were still flowing. Things were going on. It didn't recede. It was increasing for a while, wasn't it? 150 days. Upon the completion of the first 40 days, 717, when the waters were elevating, the Lord stopped the fountains of the deep underground and stopped the release of the rain from the clouds, which had been supernaturally held above the earth, windows of heaven, all right, upheld above the earth's atmosphere. The remaining 110 days was a calming of the waters before the Lord began to prepare the creation for its inhabitants. So it only increased for 40 days. There was the water from above was raining. The basically the underground fountains of the deep were releasing water, and then for that final 110 days of the 150, there it had stopped, and the waters were just kind of, there was the waters were not receding, it wasn't evaporating, right? God wasn't causing the water to evaporate. He has control over this. All right. And the waters, okay, here we go, verse 3. And the waters returned from off the earth continually, starting on day 151. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. Now, this verse is controversial. As the drying winds blew, causing the evaporation of the water continuously, the waters had abated, decreased. Though the last clause is seemingly conflicting with Genesis 7:24, a person must reason logically in order to make sense of this. So pay attention here. The waters could only be abated, decreased, if they were no longer prevailing. Logic. You can't have prevailing and decreased at the same time. They're opposites. Genesis 7:24 states that the waters prevailed for 150 days. Therefore, at the end of that time, the waters began to abate. Right? So, let me see if I got any more explanation here. I don't. Let's read it again. And the waters returned from off the earth continually. That makes sense, huh? After the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. Right? So after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. The waters began to decrease. Because what? Verse 1, he made a wind pass over the earth and the waters started to abate. Right? So we have, in chapter 7, we've already concluded that the hills were no higher than 22.5 feet. Right? So you have the dry land, and the hills are no higher than 22.5 feet. So he started after 150 days. On day 151, he started with the drying winds, water starting to evaporate. So it was abating, right? It's a swage. It was starting to recede, right? So let's move from there. The waters began to abate on day 151, right? After the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated, right? They began to abate. Let's go to verse 4. As long as you understand this concept that on day 151, the waters were starting to decrease. He had the drying wind going on. There's more. There's more. The Lord was doing more here. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. In Genesis 7:11, Moses disclosed that fountains of the deep were released and the windows of heaven were opened on the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, after Noah turned 600 years old, right? Can we conclude that, right? In Genesis 7:11, that that the mountains, excuse me, the fountains were released, right? For 150 days later, the 17th day of the month after Noah turned, okay. Here in Genesis 8:4, it was exactly 5 months later, 150 days. If you do the calculations of the date back in Genesis 7:11, and between here and the second month, the 17th day of the month, after Noah turned 600 years old, here in Genesis 8:4, it was exactly 5 months later, 150 days. This seventh month in the biblical calendar is the month of Tishri. Then the 17th day had come, which was exactly 5 months later. Upon the completion, 5 months, by the way, 5 times 30, 150 days. Upon the completion of the prevailing waters of the 150 days, the waters began to decrease, which caused the ark to rest upon the mountain range of Ararat. So how tall was Ararat at this time is the question I have. So, believe it or not, we have to draw logical conclusions here. Now, the mountains of Ararat consist of two major volcanic cones, which are called Greater Ararat and Little Ararat. Greater Ararat is the highest peak in Turkey and the Armenian highland, with an elevation of 5,137 meters, otherwise 16,854 feet, which comes to close to 3 miles high. Little Ararat's elevation is 3,896 meters, or 12,782 feet high, which is, what is that, right? It's over 2 miles. The Ararat Massif is about 35 kilometers, 22 miles wide at its ground base. So this gives you some specs on the current Ararat that we have of today, right? In no way was Ararat there that high when the floodwaters came. Otherwise, you have to have water covering it. And you know, Everest is higher than this. You have to have water pretty darn high if the whole mountains were there before the flood. And think about it, how can you abate that water down to ground level we have now with just air blowing? And where's that water going to go? It's going to go into the water cycle and then rain down to the earth and return. So we're going to still have water this high. So we need to use logic and use our brains here to know that something happened between the first day of the flood and day 151, 5 months later. So let's go to the next verse. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Huh? So if the ark is resting on the top of Ararat, apparently you couldn't see the tops of the mountains yet. The waters began to recede after it prevailed for 150 days, which was the 17th day of the 7th month, Tishri. When Moses referred to the 10th month, he was referring to the calendar month. Moses disclosed here that it was until the first day of the 10th month, which was the month of Tebet, which the waters decreased continually. Realizing that at this time, each of the 12 biblical months consisted of 30 days, we can add up the calendar days which the waters were receding. The last 14 days of Tishri counted the 17th day, plus the 30 days of the 8th month of Heshvan and the 9th of Kislev, plus the first day of the 10th month, Tevet, equals 75 days. After 75 days of decreasing, of decreasing waters, the tops of the mountains could be seen. So this was a very active 75 days. How can I say that? Well, if the hills were only 22.5 feet high, then the water started to decrease through evaporation. And this evaporation eventually brought down some water level. Maybe it dropped things down, the water level down a couple of feet, right? All of a sudden, it's resting on Mount Ararat that was still 20 feet high or whatever, right? So what happened? What happened in that 75 days that you could all of a sudden see the mountaintops all around the world, right? So let's look. Let's look. The question should be asked, how is it that these mountains became as high as almost 5 miles high, Mount Everest, if the high hills before the flood were covered after the waters prevailed 15 cubits, 22 and a half feet. So Mount Everest being over 5 miles high wasn't over 5 miles high during the flood. Think about it, you'd have to have flood waters over 5 miles high circling the globe. How are you going to get rid of that water? God, with everything's possible. God, he just removed it. Huh? God tells you how he's doing it. He's using wind, and then for 75 days, remember, we still have all the dry land was in one place. We still have 75 days. What happened during that 75 days? In fact, Mount Everest stands 8,848 meters, 29,029 feet. It should not be presumed that the drying winds caused the waters evaporating to clouds down to the previous ground level. No, evaporation didn't cause that. The information is specific, which God then presumes his people will understand that he raised up the mountains while lowering the seas floors. It needs to be understood that in order for the water to abate enough, in order to allow for the earth's flatlands to be dry, right? We're not talking to mountains being dry. We're talking to flatlands. He had manifested his power to raise these mountains and lowering the deep seas, which took the water in. The deep seas took the water in, which has enabled the dry land to appear, right? The flatland, the sea level land, the above sea level land, even below sea level land. The Himalayan mountains stand hundreds of miles away from the nearest sea, yet archaeologists and paleontologists have found fossils of sea creatures, which are miles high in these mountains. Because the secular world does not believe in the Bible and deny the power of the Almighty God of heaven and earth, they make up their own stories of how these fossils had come to be so high up. The men and women of the religion called evolution of the species make assumptions and call it science. After studying the Word of God, the explanation exists within the book of Genesis, as I have pointed out so far. As I disclosed in my commentary in Genesis 7:11, the landscape of the entire planet had changed. All plant life and living creatures had been buried with a mass movement of water. Mass movement of water. But with the mass movement of water, came the mass movement of the earth. The moving, shuffling of the water with the water fountains just pushing water everywhere. But there's something else that was occurring. This consisted of sand, gravel, and soils. This massive rush of earth buried alive everything that was upon the earth. It would be correct to contemplate there were more deaths due to being buried alive rather than having drowned from the water. The many fossils found within the soils at various depths can be attributed to the massive burial that had occurred. Then, when the Lord raised up the mountains and lowered the seafloors, the fossils remained buried in those places. That is why there are fossils of sea creatures up high in the Himalayan mountains. Everything's possible with God. He created everything, so He is almighty, omnipotent. This is easy for him. I'm going to raise the mountaintops that already had burial of all the creatures, sea creatures and everything, and I'm going to raise these mountains higher. And I'm going to lower the sea floors, which will take care of that water, right? The rest of the water, right? God is almighty. He is omnipotent. Knowing of the Pangea disclosed within Genesis 1:9, yes, Pangea is legitimate. That's why I have it on my cover of the book. Pangea was real. Genesis 1:9 confirms it. Genesis 1:9. All right. Where was I? We can conclude that the Lord had been moving the continents into place during this time that the Lord was raising the mountains and lowering the seas. The continental drift occurred while the Lord had prepared the earth for the post-flood era. This global tectonic shift was so massive and caused the mountains to be raised into their places, while the seas deepened and were able to take on enormous amounts of the waters. The waters available on the earth of today are the same waters that combined at the time of the flood. Same water system and the whole recycling water system. It's just that the water lowered into those deep seas, causing the dry land to be seen. The flatlands could be seen, not just the mountains. All right. The Pacific Ocean is almost 7 miles deep in certain locations, while the Atlantic Ocean is almost 6 miles deep in certain areas as well. It is the deepened seas that took on the water, which allowed for the land to be dried. That's what I just said, isn't it? Right? All right. Does this make sense? With God, everything can be done. Mankind can't do this, but God can. He is preparing the post-flood world for the creatures on the ark. And here we are 4,400 years later, the same living land in the same places. And yeah, it may very well be still moving. I've heard that they believe that the continents are still shifting. And that's possible. God may have done it. He's the one that did it. Let's go into verse 6. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. 40 days at the first day of the 10th month. Not 40 days and 40 nights, not after the rain. This is 40 days after the first day of the 10th month. Noah opened the window of the roof of the ark, the skylight. Genesis 6:15, there's a skylight. If we count Tevet 1, as which is the 10th month, as one of the 40 days, it would be at the end of the 10th day of the 11th month, called Shavat, that this would have been 265 days since the ark door had been closed. Right? See my math here? 150 days plus the 75. The 75 is where God is moving and shifting the underground plates and moving the continents, dividing them. All right? Can you picture that? 75 days? And then at the end of 40 days, Noah opened a skylight. He opened the window. Why didn't he open it earlier? Right? That's a question to be thinking about here. The Lord took 75 days to separate the continents, thus raising the mountains and lowering the seas. It was not millions of years, as non-believers will proclaim, but only the time between the 17th day of the 7th month, Tishri, and the first day of the 10th month, Tevet. After all the tectonic movements, Noah had waited an additional 40 days before opening the window. Remember, he's on the ark, and these tectonic movements are causing tidal waves, big waves, that could have sunk the ark. But God is in power, God's in control, he did not allow it to happen. God probably had him build this ark to be so buoyant and recede and allowed the waters to leave as it rained and out back into the ocean for where it could stay afloat, engineered by the creator of the universe. And so I'm sure that was the case, because during that 75 days, it was the most prolific, and it was just amazing the tectonic shifts of the land to cause the 7 continents dividing away into 7 continents, the one continent world divided into 7 continents, the shifting of the water and the gravel and earth and all that for 75 days. I'm not opening that skylight yet. Hold on. Things are getting really, really, really rough here. 75 days. Things calm down. Okay. Wait. All right. Let's wait a little while here, because I don't know what's going on up there. We're not going to open that skylight yet. 40 days later, he was confident enough to open the skylight and look out. Verse 7. And he sent forth a raven. So he had opened the skylight. He sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth. It is presumed that the raven did not return, but it says here that he went forth to and from until the waters were dried up. Then the raven did not return. The book of Jubilees indicates that the earth became visible on the first day of the first month, called Nisan. Book of Jubilees, verse 30 of chapter 5 says this. Also, as the 17th day of the second month, called Iyar, the earth was dried up. That's in the book of Jubilees. So we have additional information in the extra biblical books that fills in some blanks here. The translator, and believe me, I have to try to convince you guys. The Book of Jubilees was a very important book. It was so important that the Essenes, who hid the important scriptures in the caves in the Dead Sea, took all these copies with them and put them in there. 16 copies of the Book of Jubilees was there. Was it? It's not that important. Bring 16 copies of it. There were only about 4 or 5 books of the Bible that had more than 16 copies in the Dead Sea caves. So how important is the Book of Jubilees if the Essenes brought so many copies of it into the caves? Pretty important. So you need to respect what the Book of Jubilees says. Also, as of the 17th day of the second month called the Yar, the earth was dried up. Now think about it. 75 days, things are going nuts. Moving of land and all that. Moving of this, the water's receding because of the deep oceans that are being caused by the earth, the dismemberment of the one continent into 7, the water shifting everywhere and what have you. Well, the land wasn't dry. It was up. I'm thinking the soil was just drenched. It's going to be pretty wet even after the water recedes, and it's going to be like mud. So it took another what was it? What did I say here? Dried up off the earth on the second month of called Yar, the 17th day. It was dried up. Now the translators mistranslated the last clause of this verse. The inflected Hebrew verb yebes was modified into a qual-definitive construct in which states the verb is being done. The verb is being done, being dried up. That's what Moses wrote was in the qual-definitive construct of this yebes, right? Being dried up. The raven went to and from and did not come back while the waters were being dried up still. That is why Noah had sent the dove afterwards. If the raven had kept returning and the water was dried from off the earth, he wouldn't have had to send the dove. But the waters weren't done being dried yet. And so there were no trees growing or whatever. He couldn't tell if there were trees growing or not. He didn't know. All right. God just wanted him to be still until he was ready to let him off the ark. So Noah's in here and his family. Oh my goodness, when are we going to get dry land? Well, we need to know somehow. We'll just send out the raven, and hopefully he comes back with an olive branch or something, right? Well, you got to understand that he sent forth a raven which went forth to and from until the waters were being dried from off the earth. Being dried off. He didn't send the raven until the waters were dried off the earth. He wouldn't have had to send a dove. It is presumed that the raven did not return because it says here that he went to and from. So he had been going to and from. The raven's doing his job until the waters were dried up. Now, until the waters were being dried up, that's when he didn't return. If he had kept going to and from until the waters were dried up, why send the dove? If you read it correctly, if you translate it correctly, it was being dried up when the raven didn't return. You can understand the logic. The translators mistranslated the last clause of this verse, the inflected Hebrew verb yebes. Oh, I already said that, didn't I? All right. The raven went to and from and did not come back while the waters were being dried up still. That is why Noah had sent the dove afterward, because he didn't know if the waters were dry yet, if the dry land was dry yet, because it was still being dried. The translators wrongfully inserted the preposition until because they made the assumption that the waters were already dried. They weren't theologians, and they weren't real smart. Noah would not have sent the dove if the raven went to and fro until the waters were dried up. That's simple logic. Yet the translators said he sent them to and fro until the waters were dried up, when actually Moses said until the waters were being dried up. The raven didn't come back until the waters were being dried off the earth. Once the waters were being dried off the earth, the raven probably found a home and didn't come back. Once the land was there was mud and all that. He was like, oh, look at this, I got an earthworm. Yay, I'm out of here, I got food. Well, the dove is a little different. Come on, this is logic. You have to think about this. Oh, it doesn't say that here, Chuck. It doesn't say that the waters were being... Yeah, it does. Read it. The translator screwed this up. All right? The Yabes was modified into a qual-definitive construct, in which states the verb is being done. It's not finished. So the waters were dried up says that it's done, it's finished, right? It wasn't. The waters were being dried up from off the earth. I've drilled that home enough, okay? I'll move on. The translators wrongfully inserted the preposition until, which went forth to and fro while the waters were being dried up, right? Let's see. Until the waters were dried up. Noah would not have sent the dove if the raven went to and fro until the waters were dried up, right? Does that make sense? So they inserted until. All right, I'm going to read you the book of Jubilees 5:31. And the waters disappeared from off the earth in the 5th week in the 7th month thereof, and on the 17th day in the 2nd month the earth was dry. So we have it broken down in the book of Jubilees. Verse 8. And Jubilees is a legitimate book. It could even be considered. I mean, if obviously the church chose back in the 4th century to not include Jubilees into the canon, but it could have been. It was saved by the Essenes to be. It's just that the church was a bit ignorant. Verse 8. Also he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. Okay, here we have the dove. So obviously the raven didn't come back because the waters were being dried up. Right? Because the raven did not come back, Noah sent the dove each day after that until the 17th day of the month of Iyar, in order to see if the waters were abated, decreased. Right? He didn't know. He was ignorant. Noah couldn't see. All he could look out and he could see the mountains. All he could see was mountains. It was resting on a tall mountain, a 3-mile high mountain somewhere. So he couldn't see the dry land down at sea level. Because he's a couple miles up. All right, verse 9. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him unto the ark, because the waters were on the face of the whole earth. See, without the logic here, if the raven was going to and fro until the waters were dried up, then it's a contradiction to verse 9. But the translators were not good theologians, nor were they very smart to mistranslate this verse here, verse 7, right? So we need to dig and find out why there's a conflicting verse. You know, atheists and all that might use this, but we need to be prepared. We need to be ready to answer them with proper translation. All right? So because waters were on the face of, I'm sorry. Then he put forth his hand and took her and pulled her in unto the ark. Now here we have it. The previous 2 verses are confirmed here, right? The raven went to and from the ark while the waters were being dried from the earth. The raven failed to return one day. Therefore Noah sent the dove. The first time out, the dove found no dry land to rest her feet, so she came back. Because the waters were off the face of the earth, right? Because the waters were on the face of the whole earth, Noah then pulled her back into the ark. Well, what happened to the raven? If the raven went to and fro until the waters were dried up, then it contradicts this. So, gee, we need to figure this out. Well, I gave you the reason why. There's no contradiction. They just mistranslated Yabes and added a word until, which actually isn't in the Hebrew. The Hebrew doesn't say until. The translators put it in there. They twisted theology here. They twisted history. I'm sorry, but the translators have screwed the church in certain cases. Let's see. Verse 10. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. So this is a week later. From here it is very clear that Noah waited a week to send the dove again after the first time. So he sent the dove out 7 days later. He's not going to send it day after day after day. The dove's going to go, come on, guy. I mean, 1 day later isn't going to make a difference. So Noah was smart, smarter than the translators. The dove came in to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. Right? So it was just the second time that the dove went out. It was 7 days later, gave the earth 7 more days to dry up. So the dove did return to Noah in the evening. What a nice surprise it might have been for Noah to find an olive leaf in the dove's mouth. My faith tells me that the Lord communicated with the dove to pluck off the olive leaf and bring it back. That's an act of God. For the dove to understand that her job was to go out, find dry land. Well, the dry land would be wherever there's something growing. It was not soggy and causing root rot, so that there was enough dry land to cause an olive tree to grow, start growing, right? So it was the Lord who communicated with the dove to bring back an olive leaf. That's my faith. I can't picture Noah. Please bring me back an olive leaf. Noah probably prayed to God, please bring back an olive leaf in the dove, and the Lord responded. That could be, but you'd have to read between the lines there. Then you're adding something. But it was the power of God that brought the olive leaf into the dove's mouth. The overall goal for Noah to know when the waters were abated decreased, right? Right? The overall goal was for Noah to know. Once he noticed the olive leaf, Noah was sure that the land was dry, because a tree isn't going to be able to grow, and because especially an olive tree is going to get root rot. So here we have an olive tree growing. The Lord had already manifested new vegetation upon the earth, with the olive tree being the example. So who provided the seed? God did. God provided the seed. Verse 12. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and he sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. What's amazing is, if you know seeds and what have you, they're going to float. So you have the ocean and all that, everything is happening, but you got seeds floating on the water. So when it abates, you got all these seeds landing on the land eventually, thus sprouting into vegetation. So that's probably how the Lord did it. Just making a just kind of presuming, but it's probably a safe presumption. Verse 12. And he stayed yet another 7 days and sent forth the dove. Oh, I already said that. Oh, all right. Sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him anymore. Isn't this interesting? Noah waited an additional 7 days and then sent the dove again. Why? Why? He already knows there's dry land because the trees are growing. Knowing that the dove found an olive tree and having the ark resting on the mountain of Ararat, he still felt it necessary to wait an additional week. Because the dove did not return, it revealed to Noah that she found a home and thus stayed there. With easy access to finding food for herself, she no longer needed the food from the ark. The earth was sustaining life. The book of Jasher provides additional information that sounds very reasonable, which one would think was going on between Noah and the Lord. Okay, so this is interesting. The Book of Jasher, a legitimate history book, tucked away by the Catholics in France, hiding it from the human from mankind for 13 centuries in Spain. Then it was found in the 17th century in Spain. And Noah then opened the windows of the ark, and Noah still called out to the Lord at this time and said, "This is when he first opened the skylight for the first time. O Lord, who did form the earth and the heavens and all therein? Bring forth our souls from this confinement and from the prison wherein you have placed us. For I am much wearied with sighing." And the Lord hearkened unto the voice of Noah and said unto him, "When you shall have completed a full year, you shall then go forth." So he got an answer. So it's a full year. All right. So what? Let's look into that. Let's keep that in mind. The full year. The Lord did not need the raven nor the dove to let him know. The Lord didn't need the dove or the raven or the dove. The Lord most likely motivated Noah to send the raven, then the dove, as a way to school Noah on the condition of the earth, since they desired to know how much longer they had to wait in the enclosure called the ark. So remember, when the sky, this is the book of Jasher says when he had opened the window, right? Lord, when he opened the window of the ark, right? That happened way on the 40 days after the 75 days. He finally opened the window. He waited after all that ruckus and all that. He waited for 40 days and then opened the window. And at this point, boy, they are desperate to get off. Talk about cabin fever. See, just like get us off of here. Well, the Lord allowed for Noah, or maybe, or schooled him on sending the raven and the dove. He kept them busy and occupied in the encounters to educate him when it was time to get off the ark. Right? Right? Did I say that here? Wait a minute. Where did the Lord most likely motivated Noah to send the, okay, I already read that. I'm going to read it again. The Lord most likely motivated Noah to send the raven, then the dove, as a way to school Noah on the condition of the earth, since they desired to know how much longer they had to wait for the enclosure called the ark. So they were praying, "Lord, please help us." Noah and his family were experiencing cabin fever, as most humans will when confined to the enclosure without access to the outdoors. If the Lord closed up the drawbridge door on the ark before the waters came, he had control over the door to be opened again as well. So they're trapped. Oh, we can break the skylight out, but then they're working against the will of God. It was the Lord who made the decision to allow all the living to leave the ark eventually, right? So we'll find that out. Verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the ark, off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. The book of Jubilees indicates that the earth became visible on the first day of the first month, Nisan 1, just as it does here. Doesn't it say first day of the first month here? That's the biblical calendar, Nisan 1. Nisan is the first month of the biblical year. All right? Book of Jubilees 5:30. On the first day of the biblical calendar, Nisan 1, Noah removed the roof covering of the ark, which allowed for sunlight and fresh air to come into the ark. One would think that this might have needed to happen earlier, such as when the rains had stopped, but the seas were most likely very rough with the continuous tectonic movements upon the earth. Once the roof was removed, it became a ship, as we have seen in history, where views could be seen from top floor of the ship. When those walking on the top floor looked outward, they could see the dry land, which the ark was resting on in the mountains of Ararat. Right? Oh, what a relief that was. And I have to smell that smelliness in the ark. They could finally let the fresh air come in. Verse 14. In the second month, on the 7th, 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. This day was exactly 1 year and 10 days from the time that the flood waters were released. It was the 17th day of the second month, Iyar, after Noah's 600th birthday. Wait a minute. 17th day after Noah's 600th birthday, which the waters had started. Okay, it was the 17th day of the second month, Iyar, after Noah's 600th birthday, which the waters had started. That's in Genesis 7:11. At this point, it was the 27th day of the second month of Iyar, after Noah's 601st birthday, right? As Jasher 6:37 had implied, the Lord required Noah to wait after 1 year had passed before he would allow them to leave the ark, right? That's in Jasher 6:37. We had read that already. So think about it. He's going by Noah's age, 600 years and then 601st. Remember, 8:13, it came to pass in the 601st year of Noah's age. He was 601 years old. In the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up. We don't know Noah's birthday, right? But we do know that he was 601. And then in the first month and the first day of the month, the waters were dried off from off the earth, right? It wasn't completely dry until the second month of the 7th and 20th day of the month was the earth dry. So it took additional time, right, for the earth can be completely dry to walk on it and not fall in quicksand or whatever. So it took some time. Let's see, we're going to go into verses 15 through 17. We're going to read together. When I say together, as a continuous sentence. And God spoke unto Noah, saying, so this is God's voice. Go forth off the ark, you and your wife and your sons and your sons' wives with you. That's verse 15. And then verse 15 is just, and God spoke unto Noah, saying. That's verse 15. And then verse 16 is, go forth off the ark, you and your sons and your sons' wives with you. And then verse 17 says, bring forth with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, both of fowl, of cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth and be fruitful and multiply in the earth. Right? That's a mouthful, but very easy to understand, isn't it? This is the commandment that Noah had been anxiously praying for. On this day the Lord opened the drawbridge door, commanded Noah to go forth from out the ark, along with all the living creatures that were on the ark. It was Iyar 27 that this had come to pass when after 601-year-old Noah on year 27. It wasn't Noah's birthday, but it was 601. Noah was 601 years old, and then on year 27, when Noah's walking around as 601 years old, that's when he opened the drawbridge door. It was, as I already said that, it was Iyar 27 that this had come to pass, which was 1 year and 10 days upon the ark. Otherwise, 370 days inside the ark. 12 months times 30 plus 10 days. 370 days on the ark. Wow. Man, I would be so sick of being on the ark, and I'm sure Noah was too. Thus, that prayer that you saw in the book of Jasher. All right. This is the second time that the Lord had commanded living creatures to be fruitful and multiply on the earth. In the case here, he included all the living creatures that were in the ark. He had originally commanded this to the sea creatures and birds on day 5 of the creation, Genesis 1:22. Right? Verse 18. And Noah went forth, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. On the 370th day after the floodwaters began, Noah and his family, 4 couples, walked off from inside the ark. Verse 19. And every beast and every creeping thing and every fowl and whatsoever creeps upon the earth after their kinds went forth off the ark. Just as was disclosed on the day that they were entering the ark, Moses made it clear that every living creature exited the ark according to their kinds. There is no inventory stated as how many of each kind had left the ark, though it may be possible that death happened among the living creatures, but not likely, since God had control over what lived and died. Right? He's 100% sovereign. So why would he bring sickness to these animals if they were that important? Why would he cause old? Obviously, it was an old age because these were young creatures still growing. So every one of them that entered the ark, except for the ones they ate, and exited the ark. How do you know they ate the animals? Well, they had to live a year on the ark. Come on. He gave them 7 couples of each kind of creature, of the clean animals, so they were allowed to eat some of them. I'm sure I mean, God probably prevented them from deteriorating as fast. Oh, everything's possible with God. Who knows how he did it, how he worked this food for a year. But obviously they needed to eat anything that was on the ark. And so I imagine fishing was the idea. So I'm sure God kept some sea creatures alive. Otherwise, we wouldn't have sea creatures today. Noah didn't bring sea creatures on the ark. So God had a way, and so I'm sure that they were probably fishing every day as well. And Noah built an altar unto the Lord, and took off every clean beast and every clean fowl, offered burnt offerings on the altar. So here, this is interesting. The book of Jubilee states that Noah built this altar and sacrificed on the first day of the 3rd month, Sivan, which would have been the 4th day after they exited the ark. The book of Jubilees 6:1 says this. If we refer back to Genesis 7:2 and 3, we will find that Noah took 7 couples of each kind of clean beast, as well as 7 couples of every fowl aboard the ark. Though Moses never disclosed that mankind had been eating meat up to this point, many will assume that they had. Abel had sacrificed the firstling of his flock, but the Bible never indicates that they had eaten the animals. The book of Jasher 1:18 through 20 does, however, state that Abel accused Cain of eating from his flock and was unappreciative. Mankind may have been eating flesh before the flood, but we cannot be absolutely dogmatic, except for what is said in the book of Jasher, right? The purpose for the 7 couples of clean beasts and all fowls may have been for this special day. This was the first day of the new world, and the Lord had changed the biosphere of the earth. What is a biosphere? It's the living environments that we live in, is our biosphere, right? So he changed the biosphere of the earth. This day had been legendary among the tribes of the earth since this day of Noah's. It is known as the Day of the Dead. This day was a sacrifice unto the Lord, with prayer by Noah and his family. They saw close family members die before the flood. They witnessed thousands of people and animals die the day the waters came. In mourning, they burnt offerings unto the Lord in remembrance of the souls that had died. Many people died as they're quickly getting on the ark. The people were coming and oh, take us, save us, save us. They saw these people left behind. They know they were dead. All the people they knew were dead. A very sad time, to very surreal, to go off the earth, or excuse me, off the ark onto the earth, and know there are no longer human beings on the earth except for those 8. The mourning, you fall to your knees. Thank God for saving you, but mourning for these people that died. Until the disbursement of the world's populations and confounding of the languages, Genesis 11, the world may have made it a tradition annually in remembering the dead, as Noah had. Once the populations dispersed, They took this custom around the globe. The Day of the Dead has been celebrated each year by many different cultures. Because the world is evil, their pagan beliefs corrupted this honorable day into a mystical day of the occult. I won't go any further with it. We call it Halloween. Genesis 8:21. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. When we read the various statements by God, we must make sure that we do not misunderstand his intentions. The Lord educates his people continuously, therefore makes his statements to present us with his theological lesson, or his theology lessons. When Noah sacrificed the clean beasts and fowls, God recognized it as a sacrifice of something of value to Noah and his family. The clean beasts and fowl were guaranteed to survive because Noah brought 7 couples, male and female, of each kind. Because their value to man was still very high, the burnt offerings were respected by the Lord. The sweet savor of the smell of the burning animals was recognized by the Lord as being very satisfying to him, because they were sacrificing these very rare beasts to the Lord in faith and praying and in mourning the Day of the Dead. Because the Lord respected and accepted Noah's sacrifice of his animals, the Lord felt compassion for his new creation. He began his dialogue with a promise, which he can always be trusted in keeping. Moses was writing down what the Lord had informed him of what his heart was feeling. Not Moses' heart, I'm sorry. The Lord's heart was feeling at this time. Right? This is written by Moses of what the Lord was feeling. Right? So who told Moses? The Lord told Moses. And so Moses wrote this of what the heart of God was feeling after smelling the sweet savor. The Lord felt this, and he told Moses to write this. All right? This is an important introduction to God's everlasting covenant with mankind. Please keep in mind the everlasting covenant is for all mankind and not just Israel. The birth of Abraham was still centuries away, as well as his son Isaac and Isaac's son Israel, Jacob. The Lord promised never again to curse the ground for man's sake. His sins? He originally cursed the ground after Adam had sinned, Genesis 3:17 through 19. Then will inform Noah later in his disclosure of this covenant the ways that he had cursed the creation even further. Though God made this statement here, his changes had already been made because he had placed his judgment upon the creation because of man. From the point of this sacrifice acceptance from the Lord, he has kept his word. The semicolon after the noun youth is inappropriately used when it should be a comma, connecting the first clause with the second clause as a complete sentence. God implied in the last sentence that because the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. God had promised to not again smite the entire creation, even though mankind is so evil from his youth. Though mankind deserves to be judged continuously, God had declared that he would no longer do as he had here with the flood waters. Genesis 9:15 is where you'll find that. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Right? Even in the final judgments upon mankind, God had indicated that it will be accomplished by many things, including fire, but no water. Please keep in mind, God frequently places judgments with water against mankind, but these are limited judgments that never will destroy the entire creation. Hurricanes and tidal waves and tsunamis or tidal waves. But all this is God's judgment of water, by water, the use of water. But never will he destroy the entire creation by water again. Do you understand that? A hurricane is God's judgment. A tidal wave, a tsunami, is God's judgment. He's judging mankind, bringing his wrath against the wicked. Good people die during these judgments, and they go immediately before the Lord. What a blessing that is, to go home, because God brought the judgment. The God's people are in that judgment. They go home. They go to heaven to be with the Lord. What a blessing that judgment is, the tidal wave. Oh, we have loved ones. They left loved ones behind. Well, they have the ability to become one of his during that time. God's thoughts are not your thoughts. God's ways are not your ways. Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So here we have a disclosure of how God changed the earth. This judgment was placed upon the creation from this point in history. If you recall, it had never rained upon the earth until Noah was 600 years old, when it happened for the first time on the second month, the 17th day of the month of Iyar. It had never rained until then. Never was there a cloud seen. The creation was 1656 years old before the first raindrop ever fell. This was before there ever were seasons nor weather, because there was no weather or seasons. Crops were grown all year round. From this point in history, there would be a seed time for planting, so that there would be a time for harvest. Harvest time later, right? Before the snow would come. This never happened on the earth until this time, right? God brought the seasons. The last clause seems to imply that this was unusual, but day and night had not changed from the sixth-day creation. No assumptions should ever be made. The everlasting covenant was to last until the Lord destroys everything again with a fervent heat. You can read this in 2 Peter 3:10 through 12, right? He will destroy everything with a fervent heat, right? That's coming. All right. In eternity, there will be no more seasons, no more seed time and harvest, no more cold and heat, and no more night. We can read that in Revelation 22:3 through 5. And that ends chapter 8. Please hit like down below, ask questions if you like in the comments, subscribe to my channel as we continue through Genesis 1 through 11. Next up, the everlasting covenant, as stated by the Lord to Noah and his sons and their wives. The everlasting covenant is still in effect today. The death penalty is in the everlasting covenant. We'll go over that. God has assigned mankind with the duty of the death penalty. No more will God judge mankind for death, though he does, but killing someone else, the death penalty was instilled in mankind to kill a person if they take the life of another, right? To kill the person. When I say kill the person, through governmental systems, it's called um, I mean, the death penalty. It's what it is. We are told that the death penalty must be upheld, but yet we put murderers in prisons for the rest of their lives to not kill them. We don't want to hurt them. That's against God's will. That's against God's commandment in the everlasting covenant. But anyway, we'll go over that. Chapter 9. Please stay tuned for chapter 9 video. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Replay it again. It's a lot of information in chapter 8, and very, very important you understand how the earth came to be as it is today. Right? God gave us a brain to use logic. from what he's disclosed in Genesis 7 and 8, and how the earth was flooded. It started out as Pangea, one continent, turned into seven. How? Started out with hills that were no more than 22.5 feet high. And now we have Mount Everest, it's over 5 miles high. We have oceans, Pacific Ocean, that's almost 7 miles deep, or 6, 7 or 8, I don't know. It's in this chapter, I don't remember. But that's how the waters were swatched, receded, so you can see dry land, right? Common sense tells you that the water wasn't 6 miles deep. Oh, in the case with the seas, 14 miles deep. That's a lot of water. And that wasn't the case during before the flood. They just had misting systems in the underwater water tables, and there was no deep oceans and high mountains until what happened in Genesis 8. All right. May God bless you. Hit like down below. Subscribe to the channel. Until the next time, we'll be on chapter 9 in the Everlasting Covenant. Thank you for joining me. God bless.